Good afternoon and welcome to Emsi Webinars. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are excited to have our host, Matt Mee, with us today. He's the Director of Workforce Intelligence for Emsi UK. During the course of the webinar, if you have any questions, there is a facility on your control panel to put questions in, and then hopefully we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Matt. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Debbie. Good afternoon to you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're all over the country and joined by a number of people today, so excited to talk to you about the research that we've done on automation in the UK employment market. A little bit about Emsi, for those of you who don't know us, we're a labour market intelligence business working across a number of sectors. So we'll provide contact details should you like any more information on us at the end of the webinar. More importantly, I just wanted to first of all introduce some of our guests today. So delighted to be joined by a number of folks, a real stellar panel actually. So first of all, Neil Carberry is with us from the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. Good afternoon, Neil.
Good afternoon, Matt.
Thank you for joining us. Good to have you here. Alex Fleming is here as well from Adecco Group. Hi, Alex.
Hi, good afternoon.
Welcome, welcome. And also joined by your colleague Sandeep. Sandeep, welcome as well.
Thank you. Hi there.
Hi there. And Duncan's with us as well. And Duncan is the brains behind the research that we conducted on the UK job market. So I'll let Duncan say hi, and then I'll share a little bit about our plans for the session. So hi, Duncan.
Hi, everybody.
Marvellous. So the agenda for today, number of things. Duncan's going to do a presentation that really runs through the research, covering a number of topics. So one is what's the context of automation in the job market. We've all heard a lot about job changes in the way that the labour market across the country is changing as a result of technological advancement. He's going to explain a few concepts in this as well. So we talk a lot about what we call job share and task share throughout the report. So helpful for those of you that have read it, that you understand what those terms really mean. A little bit about what we define as high exposure jobs and the rationale behind that. And then we thought for this audience, particularly given the focus on the recruitment industry and the corporate industry, is what are some real examples of where that's happening across the economy, and what are the two sides of that debate. So there are risks and there are opportunities, which is really the focus of the session. And then we've prepared a number of questions. So we're going to get our panel to talk about that for around about 15 to 20 minutes, really to go through some what are the implications of this for the recruitment industry and for the HR world in its broader sense. As Debbie said at the start, for those of you who'd like to submit your questions, we'll be moderating those and having a look at those, and we'll get views of the panel of any questions that you want to share, and then some final reflections and suggestions as to what you can do next. So hopefully that sounds good as an agenda. Before we get started, we've got a poll that we'd like to run. So I'm going to ask Debbie if she can flash that up on screen. So we're going to give you 15 or 20 seconds to respond to this. So very quickly, to what extent do you think the recruitment industry will be impacted by automation? And select one of those following. Do you think it's high impact? Do you think it's medium impact? Or do you think it's low impact? I'm going to let people respond, and then Debbie will do her magic with technology and flash that up afterwards. How are we doing for time, Debbie?
We're fine. Just give them a few more seconds. I think we'll probably close the poll now. And there's your results.
There we go. So interesting. So 67% saying high impact, 33% low impact, and no one thinks, 33% medium impact, and no one thinks low impact. So we're going to run that session or that poll again at the end of this session, and we'll see if anything's changed. So I'm just making a quick note of those numbers. Debbie, if you could give me control back of the screen, that would be great, and then I'll flash on the next slide. Thank you. Just let me know when you've done it.
No problem.
Do you need to select PowerPoint?
I I think you still have control, Matt, to be honest.
There you go. Try it now.
There, right, I'm going to hand over to Duncan, who's going to share a little bit about the research and what we found. Duncan.
Yeah. So thank you, Matt. I'm going to start off with a very short potted history of the UK economy. This data goes back to 1965 and goes up to 2016, and you've got three series of data here. The top one is capital stock. So capital stock represents all of the machinery and equipment and buildings that allow us to do our business in the UK. So when we talk about automation and technology change, it means an accumulation of capital stock. And you can see that we've always been doing that. In fact, basically since the Industrial Revolution, that's been the story of our economy. And that in turn has allowed our output, our GDP, as we often talk about it, to grow reasonably continuously, as you'll see in that middle chart there. And then at the bottom, you've got the level of employment, and you'll see that actually there's no reason why increasing capital can't go hand in hand with increasing employment. So our employment history is that from the 60s through to the early 90s, employment was relatively stable, actually. Some ups and downs driven mainly by demographic changes and then recessions within that. So you'll see sort of a dip in the early 80s and in the early 90s there. And then since that time, actually employment has grown pretty prodigiously, really, with a small bump to do with the recession of 2008 and 9. It's been an incredible period of growth, really, and so you can see that actually you can see an investment in technology has helped to drive growth, but hasn't resulted in fewer jobs overall. In fact, actually we've got more jobs than we've ever had before. Our employment rate is higher than it's been on record, really. One of the things that is a bit more difficult to see on this chart is that actually the growth of capital has slowed in the past 5 or 10 years. Since the last recession, investment hasn't been particularly strong. And so, whereas employment growth has been particularly strong. And so it's interesting that we've had this kind of 5-year period where we've talked more about automation and technology change than we have done in decades. And yet actually it's been a period where labour has led capital in terms of growth. So can you go on to that? Thank you. So what we have done to understand what's going on when we talk about the sort of the potential for automation, be that an opportunity or a risk, is that rather than just saying which jobs we think are doomed, because as the previous chart shows, actually most jobs aren't doomed in a sort of such a sweeping binary way, we've actually looked at the sort of the tasks that every job does. And so we've got about 37 task categories, and we've got estimates of how much time as a percentage of each occupation is spent doing those tasks. And then we've got some data which says, well, which of those tasks are more likely to be automated and less likely to be automated. So the ones that are most likely to be automated are things where people are using physical force, they're using machinery, they're doing simple, routinizable operations that a computer can mimic. And the things that are least likely to, the things that are actually really difficult to automate, are things like looking after people, persuading people, being creative, those kind of tasks, which are really difficult to get a machine to do. And so what that allows us to do, rather than look at jobs and say they're going to be automated away or not, we can say which part of different jobs is at risk of being automated. Because actually what happened, and we've got some good examples of this later, is that typically with technology change, certain tasks disappear and other tasks become more important. And so because we've got that data, we can actually add up all of the tasks that are highly exposed to technology and look at the share of that out of the total task time and see which areas are most exposed. And that's how we get this map here. And so you'll see these kind of darker areas around London in the southeast, a bit around South Cambridgeshire there, and a few other pockets. And they're the areas that have got the sort of the lowest share of work in these high exposure tasks. And it's quite interesting because, as that description suggests, they tend to be quite highly productive areas of the economy, whereas the areas that are the closest to yellow, you might say here, are the highest. And you've got the top 10 here, places like South Holland in Lincolnshire, which is far and away got the highest share, then Anglesey, North Warwickshire. These are typically rural areas. They've got a lot of industries, be it food production, logistics, things like that, which are very labour intensive, but also susceptible to technology change. So if we go on to the next one, while we can look at it in task terms, people are interested in which jobs are going to be most affected. And so what we can say is that those jobs where more than 70% of the task time could be automated, and we're talking really over a sort of a 10-20 year period here, we can see how well concentrated that exposure to automation is. And so you get a slightly different map here. So much more darker areas across the country, the percentages are lower. You know, typically it's about sort of 12 or 13% of jobs across the whole country that are in this category of really, you know, when you're talking 70% of task time or more, if all of that got automated, then there's not a lot of a job left potentially. And so these are areas where if all these technology changes happen, they could see a lot of jobs actually lost to technology. And so similar geography in terms of high areas, but a bit different and a bit varied as well. So you've got St Edmundsbury right there at the top in East Anglia, and that is again a more ruralised area, but you've also got St Albans, which is much closer to London in the southeast and actually quite a productive area in a lot of ways. So the sort of the difference in geography is quite interesting, and I think the next slide allows us to unpack that a little bit. Well, actually, before we go on to that, we've got this one here, which just allows us to take St Edmundsbury, which has got the highest task share, and we've got one of these for every local authority in the country, so about 380 of them. And so what they do is allow us to just give us a few key metrics of how that automation risk breaks down. And so we've got the task share there, which is at the top. The white dots represent Britain, so you can see 36% in high risk tasks compared to, I think it's around 30% for GB generally. And then in terms of job share, as I say, it's about 12 or 13% in GB, and it's nearly 22% there in terms of the jobs that are at risk. You can also see a breakdown of how the amount of working time in different skill types, so analytical, interpersonal and physical, and there's a slight bias towards physical skills in these jobs. And some of the leading jobs in the area you can see there, and they're often very high risk for automation, so industrial cleaning, cleaners and domestics, food, drink and tobacco process operatives, and the leading niche industry in the area is food and drink production, so a lot of labour intensive production work. So if we go on to the next one. So what this does is it takes each one of those 280 local authorities and plots them in terms of the sort of the share of tasks on the x-axis and how that's exposed to technology, and then the share of jobs, those jobs that are really highly exposed as well. And so you can see there's quite a strong correlation, but there are these differences. And so you've got these areas. Well, first of all, it's worth saying that typically the further up you are in terms of toward the top right, then the more exposed to automation you are. And there is something of a correlation with productivity here as well. So you can see Wokingham is quite low down, and Wokingham is quite a highly productive area, whereas some of these areas at the top end, places like Anglesey in South Holland, are often quite low productivity. So that's an interesting side of it, that the low productivity areas tend to be more exposed to technology change. Then if you're further away upwards, so you've got more jobs with high exposure relative to your tasks, places like St Albans and St Edmundsbury, then these are places where technology change will impact on certain jobs a lot. And so they're areas that technology change could be really disruptive. You can see industries losing quite significant numbers of jobs. Whereas if you're below the average here, so further down towards having more tasks relative to jobs with high exposure, then actually technology change is just going to evolve the labour market in a much more gradual way, and it's probably going to be the way that you're going to see productivity increase. And so there's quite an opportunity there, really, because when we talk about technology change and automation, what we're really talking about is allowing people to focus on the tasks that can't be done by machines, because human labour is much more valuable there. And over time, of course, that means that we're getting more out of that human labour.
It has really interesting implication for the skills and I guess the location dynamic, doesn't it? Were you expecting that level of correlation, Duncan, just when you were running the data? Because it's, I mean,
yeah. I mean, you are expecting a degree of correlation because, of course, it's, you know, the same measure just chunked up in a different way. But it's quite interesting, that variation that you get and the sort of the degree of it. So it's quite useful in a way when you've got the same measure chunked up in a different way. Sometimes it doesn't really tell you that much, but this does. It shows that actually the distribution of risk from technology isn't equally shared, and some areas have it much more concentrated. So St Albans isn't particularly high up in task terms, but really is in job terms, you know. So it shows that there are certain industries in St Albans that are really highly exposed, whereas the average worker is much less exposed.
Yeah, interesting. Well, we'll get the panel's view on this in a little while. Okay, I'll move on.
Yeah. So just to conclude, really, we've got a few examples of the kind of changes that we're talking about historically. So, there's a nice photo on the right there of typing pools, which used to exist in many, especially large organisations, hundreds of workers, typically female workers, it has to be said as well, who basically their day job was to take handwritten documents and type them out. And very few organisations have a typing pool anymore. I've never come across one, put it that way. We mostly do our own typing now in most service industries, but actually we've got more admin workers than we used to back in the 1960s when we used to have typing pools. And so they're actually doing other things that use their skills. So things like organising meetings, coordinating activities, those kind of things. And so the sort of the cost of document production went so low that it was easy to get professionals to do it for themselves. Part of that, by the way, was that we went from using typewriters where a mistake was costly because you'd have to redo the whole thing to using computers where you can delete it and start again very easily. And so actually allowed businesses to offload the cost of having a typing pool and focus their admin workers on other things. So it wasn't a threat, it actually opened up the ability of admin workers to do lots of other more valuable things.
So a great example of task share, I guess, in the sense of how that sort of pool of work has evolved over the course of a few decades.
That's right, exactly. So if we go on to the next one, so we have another example here, which is car washes. So if you're old enough to remember the 90s, most people didn't get people to wash their cars unless it was a Boy Scout or somebody. It was actually that you tended to go to a petrol station and use a car wash or wash it yourself. And then actually, we've got an example here of where the robots, to use the colloquial term, got pushed back. And so actually, we've had automation going in reverse here. So from 2006 to 2016, 40% of automatic car washes closed down. And 80% of car washes that people pay for are now done manually. There's as many as 20,000 businesses out there. And essentially, this is abundant low-cost labour, typically as a result of immigration, has made automation effectively uncompetitive. And you can sometimes even see automatic car washes that have been turned into manual car washes. The same building is there, but the machinery inside isn't there. So for all the talk that automation is inevitable, actually it exists in an economic world. So if the return on investment isn't there, then it won't take place. And in some cases, as here, the return on investment can be driven so low that actually people decide to not carry on with their machinery anymore.
Yeah, it's the old trade-off between labour and capital, ultimately similar to Aurelius slide.
Yeah, absolutely. And we assume that that trade-off only works in one way, but sometimes it can be put into reverse if the conditions are right. So bookkeeping is a lot like the typing pool example in that technology has allowed them to specialize on certain tasks. And so if you go back a few decades, bookkeepers literally spent most of their time keeping books. They kept manual ledgers of financial transactions. And of course, now there's financial software everywhere, including for very small businesses. You can go online and have a system that will keep track of your invoicing and your purchase orders for you. And so actually, a lot of that work has disappeared. And so you would think that actually we'd have fewer bookkeepers today. But as the chart on the right there shows, we've got more bookkeepers than ever. That chart goes back to 2003 and up to the present. And you can see that we've added on, getting on for 70,000 bookkeepers in that time. Net across that period. And what actually has happened is bookkeepers are doing a different role now. So they're still looking after those financial transactions, but they're also doing more in terms of financial reporting because that's what is valuable. And as we've got more and more financially complex, partly because it's cheaper to keep track of all these financial transactions, there's more of an interest in looking at business operations and financial operations from different angles.
Yeah. So more strategic lens, more analytical lens.
Yeah, that's right.
And then retail.
This is quite an interesting one because, of course, retail is a transformation that is industry wide and we can see all around us. And, if you think about your traditional retail chain, it can combine supply chain, sales and marketing all in one organization. And so, you just went to the front end, which was the shop. They had the shop window. You went inside, you looked at their wares, you bought what was there. And then because of technology in different ways, that integration is breaking down. And so the most obvious side of this is online retail, which is kind of taking away that front end where you would have the shop window and you then go in and look at all the sort of the goods that they have on offer, and instead it emphasizes distribution and the supply chain. So it's all about warehouses and getting things to the front door, and the website is your only way to get to what they have. And so that, you know, if you think about the growth of supermarket retail, for example, which is this country is one of the most advanced for, that's actually transforming that industry in lots of ways, and you can see how it's changing the mix of jobs that they require. You know, 20 years ago, supermarkets didn't have nearly as many delivery drivers as they do now, and they certainly didn't have as much warehousing space as they do. But then on the other hand, high street retail is then adapting to those changes, and so increasingly you're seeing more stores that are much more about personal and interpersonal experience. And so, yeah, you can see this. A really good example, because it is a tech company and therefore you'd expect them to be ahead of it, is Apple, where their stores are much more about marketing than anything else. You know, they are there to give them a presence, to allow you to go and play with the products, see them, experience them. You can buy things while you're there, but for Apple, it's an important part of just being a physical presence that then connects you to their supply chain and their distribution network. And so, and you can also see the way that department stores are changing in the same way, much more of an emphasis on the personal experience compared to what it was in the past, because that's where the value of physical presence lies now. And so that has big implications for the skills that are demanded. You know, you're moving away from a retail model which involved lots of shelf stackers, which is possibly a bit unfair, and I was on one, so I can say it, yeah, and towards much more people who are able to deal with customers in a much more involved way, listen to what they're looking for and try and help them navigate through the products that are available. If we go, yeah, and you can see here the job change that we've had since 2003. And so the bright green line there that's racing away is warehousing and storage, and the purple line is retail sale via mail order houses and internet. And then the two lines at the bottom are supermarkets in green, and then the black is clothing. And so you can see supermarkets and clothing shops have declined slightly since 2003 in jobs terms, whereas these other two have raced away. You know, so mail order houses and internet have doubled in that time, and warehousing has well, nearly tripled actually. So yeah, you know, a phenomenal transformation going on really.
Yeah, and I think we all see that on the high street, right? Which is really interesting to see.
Absolutely. Yeah, in ways that causes problems for local authorities in a lot of ways, because suddenly you find your retail centre is maybe bigger than you need it to be. You know, so in terms of where do you go from here? Well, you know, you've got to think through the implications, not just about the technology, but through how tasks are done, how they're made up into jobs, and then how the industry's environment is changing. So the car wash example is sort of an extreme case here, but yeah, technology doesn't happen in isolation. It responds to the incentives around it. So if there are lots of workers available, that will change how you make up job roles. Then new workers for new roles, as they do change, because technology will have its effect in different places. You've got to think through, are the workers ready for those jobs as they'll be in the future? You know, so if you think back to that bookkeeping example, if you were really good as a bookkeeper in the 90s, you might be very good at handling the transaction and not so good at handling the reporting. But if you want to compete now, you've got to be good at the reporting. And so that leads us on to that third one there about equipping workers with the right skills, that it's, you know, especially those that are in really exposed markets. And so you can think about things like food production industry. Warehousing is an interesting one where, as we've seen, jobs have exploded, but actually there's a lot of technology that could take over there. So you've got to think about how to position workers with the skills that allow them to specialize in the jobs that are a bit less exposed to the technology change.
Mm-hmm. Marvellous. Well, Duncan, thanks ever so much for that. Hopefully some really interesting insights, and I guess the story that tells in terms of data is an interesting one, some of which is quite easy to see how the economies are changing. It's great to get our panel involved. So what I'm going to do, as I mentioned at the start, we've prepared a few questions that we're going to run through and just going to get some thoughts. So I'm going to start with Neil. So I've put the question up on screen, Neil, but just what are your thoughts about this in terms of, you know, what's really happening in terms of the job market and automation? What's your view, and what's the impact of that?
So when I first looked at this, I had to check myself for confirmation bias, because I spent a lot of my career telling people that we need to kill the generalizations about our labour market. This day, for instance, you know, the march of capital and technology is not inevitable. I like to tell people that the ancient Greeks invented the steam engine. They just didn't use it because they had a plentiful supply of labour. That kind of thing still happens in our market today, as Duncan's just set out. I think a couple of bits that really stand out for me. One is understanding this difference between tasks and jobs, and dealing with the tasks and how they make themselves into jobs. And thinking about that is really important for employers and recruiters. The job description is often seen as a bit of a bind when you're preparing to recruit. It's absolutely vital in this world where we don't know how technology will change the task mix of jobs over time, and it means they need to be more dynamic. The other thing that really stands out to me in that death of generalization in this world, where every time I listen to the radio, you get an amorphous blob known as the North, which is all the same. The data clearly shows it's not. Is sub-regions are clearly have different effects of technology and different growth potential, and understanding that's really going to be important, both in terms of the fact that when regions grow, they tend to grow out of one area and into an adjacent area, not kind of making the leap to another part of the economy entirely. And most of all, because the differences within regions are always bigger than the differences between regions. So making sure we're thinking about that sub-regional level when we're thinking about local labour market data, and not just about the Northwest, for instance, is really important. Alderley Edge is a lot more like Surrey than it is much of the rest of the Northwest.
Yeah, no, really interesting. Alex, any builds on or other thoughts from what Neil's just explained?
I think it's really interesting, you know, as Duncan said, you know, I think there are certain areas that are much more exposed to potential automation, you know, and I think the report shows that, and I think it also shows the areas that are least exposed. So it talks about Hackney and London, which has a high concentration of creative, digital and professional service industry clusters, being less impacted. We have a recent global talent competitiveness index report that really backs this up, and it finds that London has jumped into second spot from 14th the previous year. And I think it's due to the city's ability to be flexible to new trends and patterns, and really provide capacity for future readiness in fields like AI and advanced technologies. And also what we've also found is smaller cities such as Belfast, Cardiff and Nottingham have had their largest year-on-year growth in these emerging jobs as well. It's not just London. I think, you know, this is backed up with, I mean, you know, I read a Gartner report recently that predicts by 2022, 20% of workers engaged in primarily non-routine tasks will rely on AI. And McKinsey research also that states that AI could potentially deliver a 22% boost to the economy by 2030. So I think, and I think it is really imperative that recruiters have an understanding of the skills that are required in their local areas, as Neil just mentioned, because it does vary area to area. And this will really support local businesses best how to recruit for these skills, and also how best to upskill those workforces. Because I think there is a huge potential for recruiters to use that expertise in helping to educate candidates on the relevant local skill sets that are changing, and also on skill sets that will be needed in the future in those local areas to you know, really help sort of future-proof their careers.
I mean, fascinating insights, and I would encourage people listening to look into those other bits of research, because there's plenty of good stuff out there. And I think, given we've been through sort of the end of 2019 with the political landscape and environmental pressures, there's a whole bunch of things changing the way people are thinking about work, be it gig economies or, you know, more environmentally ways to commute to work. So lots to think about there. We've got a second question. If I can, I'm going to come to Sandeep on this one first of all. So one of the things we talked about was how well do we think organisations are preparing for automation, and is that part of their strategic workforce planning process? So just wondered if Sandeep, you could share some thoughts on that, and perhaps any examples you can think of with your clients.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. From what we've seen, organisations have started to understand their exposure to automation, but it's their need to be agile for me, which is absolutely key. Planning is important, but it's about how fast organisations can effectively react to change or keep up, which is key to success. And as we've seen business growth, the much talked about future work has already started. Things will continue to rapidly change. A report that I recently read by Willis Tower Watson suggested employers predict 17% of work will be automated by the end of this year, compared to about 5% in 2014. So you can see an acceleration within that. So yes, medium and long-term planning and anticipating skills is absolutely needed, and long-term upskilling programs are absolutely vital. But critically, organisations must start implementing change now, and that's no matter how small that change actually is. I'm really personally passionate about reskilling and upskilling, and at the World Economic Forum in Davos last week, the Adecco Group pledged to support 5 million workers through upskilling and reskilling globally by 2030. One of our businesses, an education business called General Assembly, has transformed tens of thousands of careers through pioneering experiential education in today's most in-demand skills. And they'll play a key role in reskilling, in the kind of reskilling revolution initiative. And to kind of touch on the point about an example, our clients at Adecco Group are understanding the world of work is changing. And I think the number of large organizations we're working with, we're supporting upskilling and reskilling within digital marketing, data science, and Java. And in some of these programs, we're even sourcing the talent up front to upskill and reskill it in advance of placing those candidates into some of our clients. It's great that our clients are opening their eyes to the world of a changing workplace, and they're kind of open and agile to that change itself.
Yeah, no, really interesting. I saw that announcement as well. Really interesting. 5 million. That's quite a big undertaking. So we look forward to sort of seeing the progress of that. And Neil, any thoughts from you on this one?
Well, Alex put her finger on it, which is the scale of the boost to the economy that getting this right drives. And I think there are two bits of how we need to think about workforce planning to react to that. One, Sandeep's already put his finger on, which is you can go in and ask if businesses what their skills needs in 5 or 10 years time might be till you're blue in the face. They won't know because it's unpredictable. So it's that footloose, innovative adaptability that's really the thing that we need to build in. If you've read the book Black Swan, it's that piece about robustness in our business to the kind of flow of change that we're seeing that's really important in our workforce planning, rather than saying we're going to need a lot more of skill X in the future. But the other thing that I'd put my finger on as part of this is based on some work I did a few years ago when I was comparing and contrasting investment in wholesale productivity improvements between the US and the UK. And the US and the UK spent about the same amount for similar sized companies, but the US got more from it. And they got more from it because they had a labour and capital strategy, not a labour or capital strategy. So we need to think about not technology or people, but how we carry our people with us on the technology to access the full scope of that productivity improvement Alex was talking about.
Yeah, no, interesting. And I wonder if sort of an operational level, kind of HR teams, HR directors, workforce planning teams, whether they are involved in that sort of capital and labour strategy, or if they're kind of the order taker at the end of the process and this is what we need to do about it, which would be interesting and I'm sure very different in different businesses.
So we're aware, actually, Matt, just in passing, of an REC member who worked with a client to redesign a processing line, in productivity, and gave them jobs which are more attractive to a more diverse group of applicants. So there are good stories out there if we can bring people and capital thinking together.
Yeah, no, it makes absolute sense. Perfect. Thank you very much, both of you, for sort of your comments there. And then one of the other things, obviously, a lot of the press around this topic has been scaremongering is perhaps a bit too strong a word, but there's been a lot of nervousness. So I wonder, just in general, how you see this. Alex, perhaps if you can start, but in terms of, do you see this as an opportunity or a risk or a bit of both?
Well, I think there's no doubt that it is changing, and that, but I don't think that scaremongering that automation will take over a lot of jobs is necessarily wholly accurate. I think that it has had an impact on our business, and in particular, as Duncan was talking about, in places where we've got more low-skilled workers, high-volume factory workers, production, warehousing, where we have maybe seen a decrease in requirements for temporary staff, particularly in peak periods. And I think definitely there are challenges in some areas more than others, and therefore we have to be agile. But I think also, as the report states, it's not necessarily about taking over full jobs. It's mostly some tasks within a job. Yeah. And this actually then can create new types of work as a result. So I think that the opportunity that automation brings is huge, but workers do have to think about not just the skills perhaps they've had historically, but to really upskill on those soft skills to be able to work effectively alongside AI. And I think, there's a growing number of roles that we see with direct human interaction, roles that maybe didn't exist some time ago, customer success specialists, sales development representatives. It's skills like empathy, resilience, more creative-based skills that aren't so easy to automate, as we discussed earlier. And as a result, they're becoming more and more vital within the labour market. And I think it's more just about being agile and changing and adapting, as we discussed previously.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Go on, sorry, Alex.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, and we've seen many efficiencies due to automation. One of our largest Adecco clients, who we provide predominantly factory workers to, seen 56% of candidates this year booked in to assessment centres without any human intervention. And that percentage has just been going up year after year. And this resulted in approximately 50% headcount reduction that we were able to make in that space. And 16% increase in application to hiring event selection, and also just reduced time per assessment centre at 45 minutes. So these efficiencies speak for themselves, and it means that you can reinvest that resource into other areas of your business, which do now require more resource than they did previously. So I think it's, maximising opportunities and using automation to your benefit.
Yeah, I mean, some really positive things, and I guess we'll talk about it in a while, but tangible impacts on the recruitment industry directly in your business, which is really exciting to see. Duncan, any thoughts from you just on the opportunities or risks, given you know the data so well?
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what's been said, but I think overall, in macro terms, automation has to be an opportunity in the sense that using technology to substitute machinery for low value work is pretty much the story of how we've improved productivity since the Industrial Revolution. And actually, in the past 10 years, when productivity growth has been so hard to come by, it's actually been in part because we've tended to have, to go back to Neil's categories earlier, we've been in the labour or capital, and often it's been labour space in this past 10 years. And so we need to be thinking about how we use labour and capital together again, much better than we have been of late. So I think overall it is an opportunity. But for particular workers and particular businesses, it can be a risk as well. If you're not at the forefront of the change as a business, then actually your competitors can steal a march on you if they not only find the technology, but also find a way of applying it in the industry faster and better than you. Then you could be left behind. And for workers, especially because certain industries are concentrated, if you've got a job which has got a lot of task time that can be automated, then you need to be thinking about where your future career path may lay, because you need to be thinking about what you need to be equipped with in terms of skills to move to a place where you're a bit less exposed. So opportunity overall very much, but risks at the more micro level.
Yeah, I mean, that leads very nicely into this question, Duncan. It's almost like you prepared that. Thank you. But I mean, Neil, we've talked a little bit about careers and skills. Alex has mentioned it as well. But what do you think about sort of the skills topics and what individuals should be doing as a result of what?
So I think skills is going to be really, really important as people develop their career. And we talk a lot of hackneyed language about lifelong learning and so forth, but that constant focus on development is going to be an absolute necessity for individuals. And we have to be clear about what we mean by skills. We don't just mean the kind of hard technical skills. We mean a set of behaviors and softer skills, things like presentation, that are going to become progressively more important in the labour market over time. I think from an individual perspective, it's about maximising your exposure to development. If I look at one example that's worked really well, the Gatsby Foundation's work on careers benchmarks in schools, which has really improved English careers advice, is entirely based about the number of interactions people have rather than what they do. And I think that's helpful because on skills we need to measure success, not participation. Duncan will know that over years we've looked at different qualifications that people have done through colleges and private providers and their employers, and ostensibly the same qualification can have very different outputs for different people according to how it's done, when it's done, what level it's done at. So the real measure is making sure that we're giving people experiences that are developmental, some of which will be classical training, but lots of it which will probably not be.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Duncan, I mean, anything that you'd add other than what you've already said on that? Just on.
Yeah, I'd agree very much with what Neil just said. Although I think that the one thing I would add is that actually one thing that will definitely stand you in good stead in the evolving labour market is having the the basic skills, numeracy, literacy, to a good standard. I mean, in a world where computers and machines and all of that become more and more important, being able to understand what they're telling us, being able to translate that for other people, so being able to read and write and count, are all really important skills. And so actually, while there are specific technical skills that may be superseded by technology, the sort of the basic skills remain really important alongside all of those behaviors that are going to become more and more valued because machines can't easily replicate things like empathy and resilience and so on, has already been discussed.
Yeah, that echoes the conversations I have with my son, who's 11 years old, about the importance of those things, whereas he just wants to play Fortnite.
You can now say an economist says it's so yeah, I'm sure he'll believe that even more.
Reinforce tonight's message. Thanks, Duncan. Last question before we wrap up. I'm conscious of time, so I wanted a quick round the table, perhaps starting with Sandeep, about we've already heard from Alex some of the implications for the recruitment industry, and we all work in the recruitment industry, so interested in your thoughts, Sandeep.
Yeah, I think data-focused recruitment will only grow in importance as kind of world automation evolves itself. And in the Adecco group, we've seen big changes over the last couple of years within this space already. So recruiters will also need to be sure they're proficient in interpreting data correctly. If you take AI systems, they go even further by offering continuous evaluation to workers' performance and even tools to predict their future performance. In a recent report I read about IBM, for example, they've been using Watson, which is their AI platform. During every employee review, it's apparently predicted to have 96% accuracy around future performance. Such tools can help organisations determine whether employees' future performance will be good enough for future changes that automation will bring. For me, this is the kind of data that needs to be understood by line managers, hiring managers and recruiters, and something that I will definitely benefit from. Also, recruiters will need to interpret attitude and behaviour fit of candidates, especially in a world that is changing and diversifying, something that cannot be alone assessed by automation.
Yeah. Some interesting thoughts there, Sandeep. Thanks. And Neil, I mean, obviously you represent a pretty large industry. What's your view of the sector impact?
Well, I mean, Sandeep referenced what Alex had said earlier, and I'm absolutely right, which is the idea of recruitment as a matching agency is largely on the way out in terms of being a source of employment, because that's the kind of thing that can be automated. I think the lessons of this data are probably three things. One, niche has always mattered in recruitment. So do you understand the markets that you're in really deeply? And I think that become ever more important, especially as we live in a world of relatively high employment and skills shortage in the UK. Secondly, there's a huge opportunity for the industry here to redeploy and retrain some of the resource that has been doing that matching into advisory and getting up the value chain with clients, making our clients chief execs and HRDs, not necessarily just heads of resourcing. And then the third bit, I think, is that humanity still matters in this process. A really interesting example from Sandeep at IBM. Equally, we know that there are lots of examples of AI producing some outcomes that maybe we're not looking for. The famous example where the AI started by selecting out all the women. And, you know, morality and ethicality is a role for human beings and professionals, and in that space, I think there'll always be a role for the human side of the recruitment business.
Yeah, fantastic, Neil. Thank you. And Alex, any final reflections from you?
I think probably I would just say, regardless of the size of the recruitment organisation, it needs to just adopt a technology-first approach. And I think there's loads of opportunities with technology, and good and bad, as Neil just mentioned. But it does and can make the recruitment process so much more efficient. I mean, we've recently launched through one of our brands, Pontoon, a recruiterless RPO solution. So now some of the recruitment processes are totally underpinned by a stack of integrated technologies, and that ranges from an AI-powered programmatic advertising to recruitment bots to video interviewing, which completely changes the picture for the client. And I think this doesn't make the role of the recruiters redundant, as we just mentioned earlier. It just changes their role, and it's important that therefore recruiters upskill themselves, make sure they're able to work alongside the technology to capitalize, really. And I think, you know, ultimately our role is to work alongside our clients to help diagnose and really solve their recruitment challenges. And so I think the role of a recruiter is changing in that, and technology is really enabling us to spend more time on the areas that really matter, as opposed to the things that historically have taken us a lot of time with needing a lot of human intervention.
Yeah. And so hopefully less admin and bureaucracy in the process. Absolutely. I think we can all see that happening.
More value add time for sure.
Yeah, most definitely. Brilliant. Well, thanks to our panel for their contributions there. I think some useful insights that hopefully everyone enjoyed who's on the call. We're going to run the poll again quickly. So Debbie, we'll try the technology again if we can. So you all know the question by now. I'll see if I can work out how to go back to the slides after it this time.
It should automatically happen, Matt. So I think
AI is doing that for me.
So there's your result.
So a slight shift there. Obviously, people less concerned about the impact on the recruitment industry, but still no one thinks that there's no impact, which is good to see. Right, and let's see if we can, hold on one second. It's doing the same again, Debbie. Bear with me 1 second, everybody. There we go, final questions. A couple of reflections. I think really good session. I'm not going to dwell too much or go over again what's already been said, but obviously if anyone wants some of the local reports that Duncan talked about, please get in touch and let me know. The report's available now to download if you haven't seen it, as are the 360 odd local reports. Emsi plug for those of you interested in learning more, particularly how Emsi work across the education sector, government sector, and the corporate and recruiting world. We do have our annual conference coming on the 13th and 14th of May in Birmingham, so please let me know if you're interested in attending that. just to say thank you again to all of the panel members for joining us. Thank you to Debbie for organising and making the technology work, albeit with a little bit of incompetence from me, and wish you all a great afternoon. Thanks very much.